Gold Squad TV. So here we go, man. Let this Joe Budden podcast fiasco, and I'm not speaking on the Olivia Dope nonsense, but let this nonsense that's going on with the podcast and be a lesson to all you guys out here doing anything that you're doing with your platforms. Don't ever do business with friends. You don't know what your friends' intentions are. You don't know if they really your friends. And in a lot of ways, what I learned from it is that these two fools that Joe thought he was friends with were in it for business and wanted ownership on a podcast that they weren't even a part of in the beginning. And when they didn't get it, they left the podcast like bitches and then went on their own little crusade. They pretty much shit on Joe. Joe responded probably in the wrong way. Probably should have stayed quiet. In my opinion, looking back at it now, I think Joe should have stayed ironclad. That's not what he does, but he should have stayed ironclad quiet. He should have never went on there and went at Rory and fired him on the podcast. Should have did it privately. That said, you know who your real friends are. Let this be a lesson too, that your fans aren't your fans. Fans will only fuck with you until you make mistakes. The Olivia Dope situation, although I'm sketchy about that shit, and I'm not really gonna get into it because I have my own opinions about that shit on both ends. I'm not gonna speak on that. But what I will speak on is these fickle ass fans who were just about no more than 3 weeks ago were backing Joe and saluting Joe for ownership, saluting Joe for bringing new co-hosts in there when these two bozos didn't want to come on the show. And now you look at the comments. Last time I checked on his latest podcast, he has 6.6 dislikes, over 6.3 likes. Lost a sponsorship. It's crazy how fans change on you. They're fickle. This cancel culture BS is fickle. But it really shows, whether you cancel culture or not, it really shows that your fans ain't really shit. People change in a drop of a dime. They do not care. They think they can tell you what you're doing is business. They'll sit there and try to tell you you're lying. They'll believe the other party. So now all of a sudden now Mal and Rory got what they wanted. Which is why I said Joe should have stayed quiet. Because now Mal and Rory are about to start a new podcast and they got all this popularity coming their way. Had Joe stayed quiet and stayed button on it, for lack of a better word, they don't have all this publicity coming towards their way. It probably slowly would have came out eventually, whether you agreed with it or not. But Joe should have never addressed it. I think Joe should have just said they're on a sabbatical, and then eventually said they're not coming back, and that's what he should have just did, and should have left it at that. Should have never, if they were gonna speak their mind at a little podcast and stuff like that, let them do that. But Joe decided to let his emotions get the better of him, as he tends to do. You're doing business. You never do business with friends. You never do business with people that don't see your vision, don't understand business. That said, Joe and Rory did not care about tearing down Joe. As a matter of fact, they were planning on tearing down Joe for 3 years. and they found a proper opportunity to tear him down. You'll sit there and say this is Joe's own doing. To an extent, you're right. To an extent, but those fools knew what they were doing. Come on now, let's not act like we were born yesterday. Just know that these are lessons that I take in my future things, especially. And I think anybody that has a channel, a YouTube channel, a Patreon channel, whatever, take heed to what I'm saying, because there will be people who will sit right next to you on a couch and claim to be down for your cause, and then the minute they don't get what they want, they turn their audience against you. They'll start making accusations. They'll start saying funny things. Start saying hurtful things, and they'll sit there and say it's not about the money, it's about principle, when it's clearly about the money and ownership. That's what a lot of people are missing in this situation. It was about money and ownership. They were planning to take halves on what Joe built. And if they didn't have halves on what Joe built, they didn't want to play, they didn't want to sit in line like everybody else, like Savon, like Parks. And now it's funny how Parks is being called a brown noser. And Parks didn't make money anywhere, regardless of the podcast. It's an independent contractor. You know, Savon's being called a tap dancer. You know, Freeman's being called a tap. All these people who don't have really anything to do with the business end of what happened to them, they're being made to look like they're stool pigeons, man. And it's unfortunate how we live in a witch hunt society now, where when two people can go on a little podcast after something goes wrong, they can sit there and say a whole bunch of shit, and it seems reasonable to think that Joe's doing something, quote unquote, like he's Puff Daddy, because he happens to be signed to Puff when it comes to his vault deal, like he's trying to jerk his friends. And everybody believes the fuckers that they were just shitting on 2 weeks ago. It just goes to show you, you know, everybody thinks Joe's a scumbag until you see paperwork. And when you see the paperwork and you actually see that Joe was right the whole time, Joe's only trying to obey. Joe's only trying to obey what's right. You know, he doesn't have a right to show anybody his books, and he shouldn't have to show anyone his books. That said, this is a lesson learned in business that people need to take heed to. Let's not act like Joe didn't tell these dudes to go and get their own shit together. Now, if you guys don't pay attention and do the math, you guys all turned on Joe, and now they got all the fans. You think this wasn't calculated? You don't think that they weren't planning this and planning on doing this to Joe the whole time? They were planning, you know, Joe don't even gotta believe it, but I'll tell you straight up, I see this shit from a mile away. I'm woke as fuck when I see this. They were planning on doing this to Joe for 3 years when they didn't. They started as soon as that Spotify deal happened, and they didn't get the percentages, so quote unquote, that they felt they were owed. Yeah, they were planning. They were gonna do this to Joe one way or another. They were buying time. They had this talk with their lawyers back in 2018. They were gonna do Joe dirty like this at some point. So there was never ever really any friendship. That's why I say there's no friendship in business. You can't mix those two. Friends versus BI. It is what it is. Guys can turn on him all you want. I'm not defending his actions when it comes to the whole humping thing, but when it comes to the business, when it comes to the actual business of the podcast, you see now that people are out there for your best benefit. You can tell Ice and Ish are really Joe's friends because they know the deal. They know what it is. Like they're not. You're not gonna go and tell Ish or Ice that they don't know their contracts. They know that they're not the show, that Joe's the show, to where the other two bozos out there are more important than Joe. It's going to be a while before Joe gets his audience back and gets everything back in order, but you guys all turn on him. You're going to go watch that corny ass fucking Mal and Rory podcast where they're basically ripping Joe off. And now they're going to get all this type of gas thrown their way because they did what they planned this 3 years ahead. Let this be a lesson to people, creators, people that know shit about making shit. Let this be a lesson to y'all. Snakes are always in the grass, and they'll sit there and accuse you of being a snake, and it turned out they the snake the whole time. Joe knows all this, but he has to stay legally politically correct right now. He knows those two plotted on him. He should have seen this shit from a mile away. Gold Squad TV, be careful who you trust in this business shit and any business ventures you do. Peace out. Y'all have a good night.